It's time to take another step into turning this 350Z into a bit more of a pro car. You guys saw in the last video, we cut the secondary firewall out of this thing, and today we're jumping back in the engine bay to stitch weld everything. Let's get to it. Now, if you're wondering what is stitch welding, why is it important? Well, I'll give you a crash course on it. If you didn't know, modern cars are built by stacking layers of sheet metal on top of each other, right? It's not like an old car that has a frame and then a body on top of it. Everything's all in one. And when they stack sheet metal pieces together, they are spot welded together, meaning there's little divots of welds every so often, and that's what holds those two pieces together. That works. Obviously, cars work, but you can make it way stronger if you actually weld the two pieces of sheet metal together in longer bits. So I did a little bit already. Let me give you a visual representation of what I'm trying to say. Okay, so this is one piece of stamped sheet metal. This is another piece. This is another piece, and they all kind of connect to the strut tower here. So if you see this little tiny divot there's another one there. Those are spot welds. So originally, that's all that holds this panel to this panel. They overlap, and these two little dimples are actually welds from the factory. Now I cleaned up the seam and added my own welds. So now it's held in place by a lot more, and this panel is a lot less likely to move on this one, which is going to add some structural rigidity to the whole thing. Obviously that was one tiny piece. We still have a lot to do, so I'm going to get to work. And I'm going to show you guys how to do this, because if you have a car this far apart and you're building a race car, you might as well stitch weld at least the important bits, which in this case are the strut towers. They see a lot of force with the entire front suspension literally bolting to it, so the stronger you can make this, the better. Okay, the next piece of the puzzle I'm going to tackle is this little plate that goes around where the strut actually bolts. Now, if the strut just bolted to sheet metal, it would be too thin, it would cause too much stress. So they put this extra layer across the top. But again, it's only held in by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 7 little spot welds. So I'm going to go around and weld this plate to this panel, just like we did up here, in a few little kind of stitches. That's why it's called stitch welding. And it'll just make this whole area a lot stronger. Now you can see over here I already started prepping it, but I'm going to show you guys how to prep it in this area, because this is all factory paint. Obviously you can't weld through factory paint, so let's clean that up. Okay, now you don't want to come in here with a grinder and grind a bunch of this metal down, because again, it's thin sheet metal welded to thin sheet metal. So we don't want to take any material off. So we're going to prep it by burning the paint off with a torch. Once you've got your paint all crispy, come in with a wire wheel, on a drill, on a grinder, anything like that, and we'll just blast that paint out of there. Once you've got it all nice and clean, all that's left to do is fire up the welder and glue these things together. Definitely not perfect, but I am getting better at welding, and I'm pretty happy with most of that. There's a few ugly spots like way up there, but like down here, that looks decent. Now, one other situation you may run into when you're doing this kind of work is a lot of the seams from the factory are spot welded like I showed you, and then they run a bead of seam sealer, basically like a rubber sealant kind of thing, on top of it, so no moisture can get in between those panels, because that will cause rust down the road. We don't need the seam sealer, and we actually need to get rid of it if we're going to weld the seams together, because you can't weld through rubber sealant stuff. This seam right over here, this is all that like rubber stuff. Now the best way I've found to get rid of it is just grab a chisel and you kind of work your way in here. And once you get under it, comes off like that. So I'll clean the rest of this up, same method with the torch and the wire wheel, and then we'll be ready to weld that one in. I actually started doing it over here, so this is the same seam, but this one's been cleaned up already. Now it is important when you're prepping these that you really get in between the seams. So even on that one, like that's why if you saw me holding the wire wheel not straight down but at an angle, Really trying to get pieces of that wire wheel up in there so that when I weld it, it's nice and clean. Because if there's still some seam sealer or anything kind of in this seam, your welds are going to look real ugly and they won't be very strong. Lots happened since that last clip. We have taken a deep dive down the rabbit hole, and we are going to keep going because I keep finding little things that I think I could improve on. And we still have a lot of stitch welding to do, which is still going to be the main focus of this video. But as you can see, everything's out. We took the brakes out, all the brake lines. The master cylinder, we're going to be swapping over to manual brakes, which will be a whole nother topic. But let me catch you up to speed, and then we'll get right back to work. I've got most of this strut tower stitch welded, except for the back side. As you can see, I started prepping that. We'll do that seam there, and then some stitches all the way down. And I was watching Alec Robbins' pro build, and he cut these off. So these are their own little pieces of metal. We're not going to be running a strut tower bar, so I don't need those. And aside from saving weight, the real reason I want to get rid of this is because I'm going to plate the front of this to build a tube front end off of. And yes, I could like notch the plate around this, but I'd rather just get this whole thing out of the way, and then I can overlap the plate here and here and up here and here, and then we'll have a super strong corner to build our tube front end off of. So let's cut some stuff and get back to stitch welding. Okay, I can confidently say if you're not planning on doing a tube front similar to how I am, this definitely is not worth your time. It didn't take a crazy long time, but it was definitely more work than it's worth. I will say the strut tower looks way cleaner, and now I can stitch weld even more with that out of the way. But if you're just doing this to save weight or to have something that looks a little bit cleaner, I don't think it's worth it. But can't deny that it looks pretty cool. That whole area is nice and open now. And we'll be able to stitch weld this whole seam all the way down and this whole seam all the way across, where before we had to stop there. And we can add some stitch welding to our little plate here too. The hardest part about cutting this out was not cutting too deep. So you can see I cut a little bit too deep into this one and a little too deep into this one and that one and a little bit there. Some of them came out perfect, like up here, all that looks good, but it was tough. Again, I wouldn't say that was worth it unless you're planning on doing a tube front the way I am. Again, that's going to be with a plate that kind of wraps around this area here, like here, and then it'll come off of that. But now that it's done, let's finally finish up stitch welding this side because we still have this whole side to do. Okay, I'm calling that done. I even filled in a little spot where I cut too much. Can't even tell. Stitch welding looks good. Did the back side of the strut tower. All the way up there, all the way down. And since I had the welder here, I went ahead and welded up that seam. Still have to do the patch panel over there like we did over there. If you saw my last video where I cut the whole firewall out, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But yeah, feeling pretty good. Now we jump over here. All right, you guys saw me stitch weld the chassis. I told you how to do it, but I haven't talked about if you should do it and if all this work is even worth it. So let me give you my opinion. Now, before I tell you whether stitch welding is worth it or not for your car, you need to define the goal for what your car is going to be. Like I've said before, this car is going to go pro at some point. So I might as well take the extra steps now and really prep the chassis. But if I was just building this to go have fun with the boys, get some tandem laps, just get some seat time, this wouldn't really be worth it. Because again, stitch welding, it does make a difference. It's adding structural rigidity, it's going to make the suspension react better, and the car is going to hold up better in a crash, which are all really good things. But I don't know that all this work is worth the small percentage of improvement that it makes if this is just going to be a seat time car. So take a minute, reflect on what you want out of your car, and then determine whether you think this is worth it or not. For me, at this point, it's worth it. All right, this is where we're leaving off. To recap, my main focus here was to stitch weld all the high impact areas that are going to see a lot of stress from the suspension components coming up into the strut tower and anything that could get hit in an impact, being, again, the suspension, like the front wheel. It's all going to put stress in this area. So we stitch welded all that. Got our seams all the way up and across, our little plate coming down. and on the back side of that strut tower as well. Again, I've never claimed to be a welder, fabricator, or anything of the sorts, but every time I take on a project like this, I learn more and more, and I improve on these skills more and more. Again, I've still got a long ways to go before I'm really good and proficient at this kind of stuff, but this is so much better than the welding I've done even a few months ago, but especially a few years ago. So I'm happy with this. It's definitely gonna make a difference in this car, at least in the long term. And I hope this is a little bit of inspiration to you guys that you don't have to be an amazing welder and fabricator to take on a project like this. If you've already got your motor out and you've got a little welder like I do, get in there and go the extra step, at least if it's a chassis you plan on keeping for a long time, or if it's something you want to take up to another level of competition. And this car checks both of those boxes for me. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. We are one step closer to getting this thing back together. Drop a comment down below what you want to see next, because we've got to build a tube front end for this thing, but I also have a motor I have to tear down and rebuild so we can get it in here. I should probably just show you guys the new motor, huh? Regardless, make sure you're subscribed. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and of course, catch you in the next one.